But in all candor, I would tell you it's outrageous filth. So I'll be looking from this senator's standpoint not just to bring pressures, but to try to see if there is some constitutional provisions, a tax or approach that can be used on the Congress to limit this outrageous filth.
Senator Tribble.
Now, the effects of such lyrics on a well-adjusted child may not be cataclysmic. Rather, the emotional damage is more subtle.
Fire and chains and
rock and roll.
This is Pacifica Radio's presentation of ZAPPA on censorship. Rock musician and political activist Frank Zappa in conversation with KPFK reporter J.B. Peterson. Recorded at his home in Los Angeles on the 21st of June 1990, Zappa discusses his views on the forms and implications of censorship in American society.
My name is J.B. Peterson, and this is the KPFK Pacifica Radio presentation of ZAPPA on censorship with our special guest, Frank Zappa. Let me start by commenting that in the last few years, maybe even the last decade, has been a real difficult time for people with a progressive orientation, but the last few weeks seems to be a kind of culmination of the whole Reagan-Bush era. We've had the director of the Contemporary Center of Arts in Cincinnati indicted on charges of obscenity for displaying photographs of Robert Mapplethorpe in a place called Empire, California. The local school board removed 400 copies of Little Red Riding Hood because Little Red had a bottle of wine for Grandma in her basket of goodies, and they felt that they didn't ban the book, they'd be condoning the use of alcohol. We've had the Supreme Court on flag burning, and last but not least, of course, Two Live Crew getting arrested and retailers being arrested for selling it. Do you see these as isolated incidents, or perhaps somehow being subtly related?
Subtly related. It's all
blatantly related.
It's all coming from the same source. This is all the work of Christian fundamentalist organizations.
Do you think that from these fundamentalist organizations are pushing their agenda on the nation, or do you think these are actually centrist concerns coming from Joe Average Adult?
I don't think Joe Average Adult cares about these issues. I think he's got more important things on his mind. But I believe that the fundamentalist right certainly has a political agenda, and it's something that George Orwell would have been proud of.
How are they networking? How are they collecting all their ammunition together outside of the mainstream? I mean, there's not a Jerry Falwell who's leading the flock together. Is it a direct mail? Do you know anything about that?
Well, in the case of Two Live Crew, it's being spearheaded by a guy named Thompson, a born-again Christian attorney who is fronting for a number of these Christian so-called family organizations. And the reason why these people have so much power is because all of the regulations that control the tax exemption status for religious organizations, all of that legislation which exists and could stop this situation is not being enforced, or it's being randomly enforced, or it's being enforced in favor of the Christian groups. In other words, the tax exemption, the language in the tax exemption regulation states that if you want to have a tax-free status for your religious organization, you may not lobby for or against any legislation or for or against any political candidate. And as far as I can see, everybody from the Catholic Church on down has been violating that, and they should be taken to task for it. If they lose their tax exemption, then they won't have access to the kind of dollars to mount these PR campaigns to make this stuff happen. The IRS is charged with the responsibility of enforcing those regulations, and they're just not doing it.
How come the progressive politicians, the liberal politicians, if that's not a naughty word, are having a hard time dealing with this? I mean, these troubled times of global changes and serious youth concerns like drugs and teen pregnancy, how come they're going after these symbolic issues?
Because it gets your name in the papers, because it'll get you on television. You use all the buzzwords, and you strike the right pose and have a flag in the background, and it gives the illusion that what you're doing is speaking on behalf of a silent majority. And this is a technique that these guys have been using throughout the Reagan years, and it's continuing well into the Bush administration.
They're varmints.
How come they control the power, and how come...
Because they have a lot of money.
How come Democrats or politicians from the left have a hard time stopping it all? How come they, I guess it's the Democratic Party problem is what I'm asking you about. How come they can't?
No. It ain't that. It ain't the right guys versus the left guys, because first of all, I don't see anything really creative happening on what could be described as the left. And the Democratic Party, I'm sorry, folks, this is a waste of time. The whole idea of party politics has been superseded because the people who are the extremists on the right, they're Republicans in name only. What these people really are is fascists. Call a spade a spade. The basic Republican conservative philosophy is you want a smaller government and you want lower taxes. I think that's fine. Now tell me, sum up in a couple of words, what's the Democratic philosophy? You got something better than that as a Democrat? Smaller government, lower taxes. I want to see that. All I can detect on the Democratic side is chaos. So many little agendas. No big name value force, to an electable force that they can put on a ticket. They're in a mess. The Republicans, if they don't have an electable name value force, they'll make one from scratch because they got the cash to do it.
And Madison Avenue to create it.
Remember, the Republicans were the first party to use a Madison Avenue advertising agency. BBD&O was the first one to get the ball rolling.
How are they ever going to win, though? How can they put candidates in office who hopefully believe in progressive ideas if they have to appeal to a farmer in mid-America to get the vote, or to get the vote in California?
There is such a thing as community standards, like it or not, and they vary from place to place, and there are different concerns from one region to another. People in the Rust Belt have different concerns than people in the Sun Belt, as opposed to people in the Dust Belt and all the other belts. They're different regional concerns. And my analysis would be the best campaign that you could mount at this time that would cut across all of this is for a candidate to say, look, we've got some economic problems, we've got some social problems, we've got all kinds of problems, but there's one thing that I can guarantee you. I'll guarantee you that if I'm elected, you won't have any deterioration of your constitutional rights. If all else fails, you'll still be an American because I'll protect the Constitution. I want to see a politician stand up and say that and be able to deliver on it. Because I think that's the kind of a thing that no matter what your economic status or what part of the country you live in, you don't want to see the basic thing that allows you to be an American to be thrown away. That's the Bill of Rights. And there's not one guy that is in office right now that would stand up and say that and be able to deliver on it. George Bush never could. Reagan certainly couldn't. I don't see one Republican that would dare to make that statement.
How are the Democrats going to be able to deal with the flag burning issue? Because that's
well,
a symbol.
I watched it on C-SPAN this morning, all these speeches, and most of them were against the amendment. Now, the language that was used in the speeches basically went like this, that the Bill of Rights is there to protect the right of people who espouse ideas that the average guy may find repugnant, but he has the right to say it because that's what freedom of speech is all about. Now, why aren't they saying that about Two Live Crew? They never would. It's just that the whole flag burning thing is a political football, and you can posture and pose and get in there and look like Joe Blow statesman and make those kinds of things. But nobody is standing up for the rights of Two Live Crew or any other group who wants to say what they have on their mind. You can agree with them or you can disagree with them, but it should be your right to decide after you heard what they have to say.
Any predictions on how the flag burning thing is going to go?
I don't think that it's going to pass. I don't think that it's going to I don't think it's going to get out of the Congress.
So there won't be, your prediction is that there's not going to be a constitutional amendment?
I don't think there will be. I think we're going to get off lucky on this one. It's going to be close, but I don't think that it's going to be brought to a vote.
If it is brought to a vote and Democrats are up for election this fall, do you think that could cause them to be more conservative than they might otherwise be?
Probably.
We're talking about freedom of speech, Frank, and another thing is the banning of books. I mentioned earlier in the setup that...
Little Red Riding Hood.
Yeah.
Huh?
What do you think about that?
Well, that wine can be awfully dangerous, but certainly not as dangerous as beer. I think that it's going too far to throw the book out because it talked about wine, but if Little Red Riding Hood was taking beer to the grandmother, I'd raise my eyebrows at that.
Fahrenheit 451? What do we have here?
Well, there are certain precedents in other restrictive societies that we could be looking at. We're not quite to the stage where we're piling books in the middle of the town square and setting them on fire, but it could happen. There are Christian groups that go from town to town, like, what do they call, what's the name of those brothers? Peter's brothers,
Steve
who
Peters.
have been going from town to town for 10 years sponsoring record burnings in the name of Jesus. That's their hook. They come into town, bring your evil rock and roll records and we'll burn them for you, in the name of Jesus. So maybe that wouldn't play in the heart of New York City, but it certainly plays in some small towns. I know they've visited Pennsylvania, several places, and a friend of mine actually went to one of their meetings to see what was going on. Came back with some horror stories about the kind of stupidity that is being promoted. And these guys, that's how they earn their living. Burn records, take up a collection, publish literature, sell pamphlets, sell tapes about backwards masking, all this kind of stuff. It's a racket.
Talking about Little Red carrying a bottle of wine. What happened with that? Has it become trendy to kind of say, well, I'm no longer drinking alcohol anymore? Was this something pushed on us by Nancy Reagan? And has it affected people's mind?
I don't know. I'm not a big drinker myself. I happen to like wine. I like it with food. Could never imagine just sitting around drinking wine for no reason at all, or same with any other kind of an alcoholic beverage. It's just not my lifestyle. But I think that if you want to drink it, you have the right to drink it. So long as it doesn't impair you and you get in a car and kill somebody, you want to do whatever you want to do with your own body, up to and including killing yourself. So you don't have the right to kill somebody else, but if you want to kill yourself, whether you do it fast or you do it slow, that's your business, because you own yourself. That's what personal freedom is all about.
Part of the new proposal for the NEA language keeps referring to something called the sensitive nature of public sponsorship. Let's start talking about the whole NEA grant, because you see these things.
Let's call a spade a spade. The total amount of the budget for the NEA is what, $157 million a year?
Yeah.
Okay, compared to everything else that gets spent on a federal level.
Peanuts.
Yeah, less than peanuts. And I debated this issue on a TV show called Crossfire with a guy named Dannemeyer, who's one of the people who would like to see the NEA disposed of. And aside from the fact that the overall budget is small, I asked him specifically how much money had been spent out of that budget for those projects which they deemed objectionable. You want to know what the total amount was? $45,000. So $45,000 out of $157 million. We're talking micro peanuts here. And
one or two people possibly, right?
Right. The bulk of the money from the NEA, and the part of the NEA that I personally support, is those monies which go for community activities that involve multiples of people. In other words, NEA would sponsor orchestras, they sponsor ballet companies in cities where they wouldn't have any kind of activity like that. I question the need for the NEA or any government agency to be involved in the funding for individual artists. You owe them something, and you run the risk at all times, especially with this new language, that the government can influence the quality of the work or the content of the work.
Language of the new NEA proposal says that this act demonstrates a commitment to artistic excellence, which is sensitive to the nature of public sponsorship and does not deliberately denigrate the cultural heritage of the United States or violate prevailing standards of obscenity or indecency.
That means if you take this money, you will keep your mouth shut. That's layman's translation.
Well, how would you feel about artists who take that money? I mean, you might as well...
Well, I feel sorry for them, because under these circumstances, you would definitely have to be a desperate individual to take that tainted money. It's tainted money. If you sign a piece of paper that says you will do those things or avoid doing this list of things that they have in there, you're putting yourself in a box. But they're all different kinds of artists, and they're all different kinds of economic needs, and I'm sure that there are extenuating circumstances, but I believe that the people in the U.S. government would be just as happy to have nobody take the money, because it's just another way of wiping out the NEA. The people who sponsor this don't want an NEA to begin with. They would like to kill the NEA. They've said so. And so I think that every artist has a right to earn a living and stay alive and be supported, but when you have a government agency that is demanding that all the work that be done according to a formula set up by the United States government, what kind of art is that? That's propaganda. So you might as well go around and hire all the artists in the United States, say, hey, you want a job, you have to do this non-content and boring stuff that we will approve. I think that is not something that I would support.
So you think several of the people who are recipients, who are turning down the money, the choreographer here in L.A., the Shakespeare Festival in Oregon, that's an effective symbolic gesture?
Well, I think it's a symbolic gesture. The question of effectiveness, I don't know, because most people in the United States don't care about art. Certainly nobody in the government cares about it. That's reflected in the amount of money for the budget. And because we don't care about art, it makes it a little bit difficult for us to act as a real international player, because other cultures on this planet can project their will or project the personality of their people through their culture. They have a ministry of culture, or they have some mechanism by which the better thoughts of that society are projected to other nations. We don't have that. We never cared about it. What we project to other nations is military force. Now think about that. We're supposed to be the land of the free, the home of the brave, but actually we're turning into bullies, and we're turning into cowardly bullies at that. Worse than that, indebted, cowardly bullies. We don't even have enough cash in our own bank account to go out and buy the weapons that we're using to impress everybody. We've got a national deficit because we borrowed money to build bombs that we're never going to use. So that means we're not only an indebted bunch of cowardly bullies, we're also really, really stupid and pretty bad businessmen to boot. Look at what these guys are doing. You know, you look at the S&L crisis, $500 billion so far. $500 billion. Now, how much money is that? Well, for $500 billion, I think you could build all the new hospitals you ever wanted. You could take everyone in America who is homeless. Let's say there's 3 million homeless people. You could give each one of them $1 million. You could take care of all the bad roads. You could, all these parts of the country that are affected by floods over and over again, you could fix all of that. That could all be done. We could turn the United States into utopia. Instead, what do you got? You've got guys who already made a fortune off of it, who are still living in their mansions, who have never been brought to justice, and they have been able to pull off this crime of the century. This is a big, big robbery now. $500 billion is a big robbery. And they've done it with the assistance of people in both parties in the Congress, to say nothing of the activity of Ronald Reagan. It's not just the Republicans who have done this. The Democrats voted for a lot of this stuff, too. And the way I look at it, they all belong in jail. People forget that the government is something that you own. They work for you. You pay their salary. This is not something that is put in place to rule you. They work for you. And you should regard the activities of anybody who's in public office the same way. If you were an employer, you were going to regard the work of an employee. If the guy is stealing from you, he's your employee, what do? Hire him, keep paying him more money and keep him on the job? I'd go in there and look at the voting record of everybody in the Congress and anybody who allowed that deregulation, that set the stage for the S&Ls to crumble like that. Send them to jail. They're varmints. Get them all in jail. And not a country club jail either.
Frank, how come it seems that we're not hearing about the SNL thing as much in the media as we should? I mean, you'd think the role of any watchdog would be get excited if there was something that they could grab on. Are they not doing their watchdog role properly anymore?
Watchdog? Look at who owns the media. Who owns it? Liberals? I mean, all the media outlets basically are owned by the forces of evil. These are guys who will take that phone call from Sununu at the White House, and if he doesn't like the spin that you're putting on the news, you're going to change your spin.
All right, well, what's changed from the days then when Watergate?
That was an amazing thing in American politics, because nobody had ever thought before that we could have a president that was such a scumbag, that would stoop to something like that. That was a shock to the American mentality. But after that, we found out that was just the beginning. That was the tip of the iceberg. Under Ronald Reagan, you had Oliver North, a man who in the course of his activities, drafted a plan for the suspension of the U.S. Constitution, and nobody batted an eye. Don't we remember that? That was what he did. It wasn't just shipping a few arms here and taking a few bucks there. And when you get right down to it, the reason you're not hearing more about the S&L situation is there's CIA involvement in it. They were using the S&Ls to launder money to help pay for the war in Nicaragua. In one case, in Florida, Singlob and this female talk show, conservative talk show host from a radio station. See, I was discussing this the other day on KFI with Tom Likas. You know, he said he used to be on the same station with this female conservative talk show host, and she was always, you know, dealing with the Contra topic and all the rest of that stuff. Well, she was a partner with Singlob in an SNL, which was doing this. And there was other SNLs in Texas that were doing this. There's a lot of people that would like to see the whole topic of SNLs go away, but let's don't stop there. Let's take a look at HUD and all the favors that were done. You could get millions of dollars of free money from HUD if, one, you were a Republican, and two, you were a born-again Christian, because at the time that was the prerequisite for getting your deal approved as opposed to somebody else. And they were always looking to see whether you were a Republican supporter or whether you were a Christian.
So if we don't have free speech radio like Pacifica, do you see mainstream journalism, real journalism, hard journalism as something that's going to soon become a thing of the past?
I think that hard journalism is already pretty soft in this country because it's not the reporters' fault. The reporters do dig up the news. They find the stuff, and they try and get it into the paper. But remember, the paper itself is owned by guys who are usually of the Republican or extreme right persuasion. And they're not going to print certain things. There's certain kinds of stories which never get into the Los Angeles Times. There's certain stories that will never get into the Washington Post. And there's certain stories that will always get into the Washington Times because of the kind of paper it is.
Do you think that a lot of stories don't get into because they're not sexy enough, because they're not glamorous enough, because they're not, well, in the case perhaps they're too intellectual or something?
No, in the case of TV, the story's not going to go on unless there's a good picture, because TV is a pictorial medium, but there's no excuse in the world of newspapers, and news is news.
I'm talking about even people who were semi-respected talk show hosts in years gone by where they did a lot of political analysis, they had a lot of political guests, and now they're not having them anymore because they're having only flashy things, glitzy things, things that will get ratings.
Well, ratings have always been a matter of concern if you're in an advertising-driven medium, and even a newspaper is an advertising-driven medium. Do you think that if you were going to do an expose on the evil doings of a large department store chain, that you had a newspaper that wouldn't harm your profit picture?
You mentioned a bit before about the economics of all this, and government sponsorship of the arts is one thing, but commercial considerations of moral content is kind of a whole other ball of wax. In the last couple of months, we've seen threatened boycotts for Married with Children, Domino's Pizza pulling their advertising off of NBC's Saturday Night Live, the whole thing with The Last Temptation of Christ, where boycotts were threatened. Do you think the economic bottom line is a way of, corporations who own these things of causing content producers to censor themselves?
Of course.
Bottom line.
Bottom line. It's one guy or a board of directors who decides, well, we're going to shove our weight around. We have the cash, and our cash is the engine that drives the media, and we will withhold the cash unless we have things our way.
How did it work 20 years ago when independent record companies, small-timers all around the country could survive against the big-timers? CBS still existed back then. How come the little guy had a better chance of surviving then than he does now?
Well, I think it's a matter of sophistication, that the business has become more sophisticated and has gotten smaller in terms of the number of players, because a lot of those little companies that you mention in this mythological golden era of the past, they did disappear. If everything was so good for them, they'd still be around. Most of them showed up, made a couple of bucks, or lost their shirt and got out of the business.
And got gobbled up by the big guys.
Or just gobbled out of the picture. They weren't assimilated into the larger companies. They were just knocked out of business. The problem of being a little independent record company is, let's say you've got a company with one artist, and that artist has a record which is a hit this week, and it's really hot, and you have to press tons of records and ship it out into the stores. Guess what? They have 90 days to pay you, and at the end of 90 days, they won't pay you because you got nothing coming up later that gives you leverage that allows you to collect from the retailers. So the retailers have played a role in putting these guys out of business, too. I know because I went through it myself with an independently distributed label in the late 60s. And we were put into a position where in order to collect from the retailers, we would have had to sue them under the laws of every state where the retailer existed. And they know that, and so that's one of the reasons why small labels have to be distributed by larger labels, because the larger label has the muscle to collect from the retailer.
I'm going to get a little bit more on mainstream kind of stuff, because we're talking about economic bottom lines, and most people get their mass culture from either big record labels, as we said, or from television and things like that. And in mainstream films, where producers are getting more and more concerned about not showing a lot of drinking teens and having to show pro-social values and having to have sex with condoms on. That's
silly, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's silly and it's boring, and you'll get more of it unless people decide that they suddenly don't want to go watch those movies and don't buy tickets to it.
Do you think that'll eventually cause a rebirth of independent filmmakers, European films in America?
No, because there's a distribution bottleneck. All of this hinges on, if you make a product, how do you get it to the marketplace? In the case of films, look at how they're exhibited. You have a lot of little independent theaters. Suppose you're a person and you're given the choice between going to Joe Blow's little ratty theater that'll show anything, or to some Cineplex situation that's better sound and cleaner seating and all the rest of that. You can't get into those major exhibition facilities unless you're putting in the kind of product that they will exhibit. And so an artist can make whatever he wants to make so long as he can afford to make it, but he can't sell it unless he can get it through the distribution chain. That's the same story with a record, with a film, or any other kind of thing.
Well, you tell me, are you being pessimistic about the future? It seems like isn't there a chain in popular arts where things get conservative and things get more progressive? It seems like you're suggesting it's just going to keep on getting more and more conservative.
No, I'm not suggesting that at all. What's conservative about Two Live Crew? Is that conservative? That exists today.
Indeed.
Okay.
More outrageous.
So, I mean, I don't even think it's outrageous. It's just, it's one of those kinds of things. All right? And it does exist today. There's all different kinds of things which exist today. Conservative, liberal, progressive, absurd, you name it, it does exist today. But what you know about is only what manages to get through the distribution channels. There are plenty of artists doing things, I'm taking this on faith, but I'm sure that there are people who are making music and doing all kinds of things which are progressive, but you just don't hear about them.
Well, not hearing about them means that for a lot of people, not hearing it on the radio, and we've had now, I don't know if this is coincidence, but now music is accessible through the portability of portable cassette machines and stuff. So is that a way of getting around having to go through a radio station if you have songs with, quote, obscene lyrics on it?
I don't know whether I would think of that as the way to get around hearing it on the radio. I mean, what's the big deal? I mean, these are only words. Remember that thing about sticks and stones can break your bones? Words will never hurt you?
Yes, but words could cause you to lose your radio station license.
Yeah, well, I think that is the product of an administration which is not to be trusted, installing people who would like to put a clamp on the marketplace of ideas. And they use the whole issue of obscenity to create a mechanism whereby all ideas can be filtered, sorted out, and controlled by the government. It's a police state mentality. The FCC was originally chartered to make sure that your transmitter doesn't get suddenly turned up and blow out somebody else's transmitter. It was to regulate transmissions. It wasn't to regulate ideas. It wasn't to regulate speech. It was never chartered as a censorship organization.
But now we have pending congressional hearings and such something called the Helms Amendment, where they're proposing a 24-hour ban on anything questionable at all. Indeed, KPFK, our radio station, had to spend lots of money last year to secure with lawyers that when we read a celebrity reading of The Grapes of Wrath, we wouldn't get our butt in a sling with the government. What are your feelings about the proposed Helms Amendment?
Well, they've been after Pacifica for years and years and years, and, you know, Jesse Helms I have no respect for. I won't say he's a stupid man, because I've seen him do some things which are fairly clever, but I think that he's a menace to the Constitution. That's the nicest thing you could say about him, because a man like Jesse Helms has no place in the U.S. Senate. He would have done pretty well in Hitler's cabinet, but not in the U.S. Senate.
So before all this had occurred, we had, you said before, Pacifica had trouble for years, going back to the 70s with the Carlin case, and more recently with KPFK, the jerker. Since broadcasting is everywhere, and you can't always stop it from playing if you're in a car or in a mall or whatever like that.
That's ridiculous. Anybody, you know, if you're smart enough to turn a radio on, you got to be smart enough to turn it off. And if something is offending your ears, I mean, how much protection do you really want in this society? And what are you willing to give up in order to have protection from words that some people don't like? What are we willing to throw away in order to make sure that no word that Jesse Helms disapproves of ever escapes the lips or squeaks out through the airwaves on anybody's radio station? What are we really willing to give up in order to have that kind of security? Who are we protecting, and what is the net result of the protection? And how could we be so stupid as to even involve ourselves in a discussion of a matter of so little consequence? It's about little words, not even long words.
They had a special committee developed for considering what Helms is proposing, and rumor through the grapevine says that committee stacked. It's kind of was just a fake thing to go through the motions, but actually the Helms Amendment is going to pass, and material of an artistic or sensitive nature won't be able to be played without risking your license.
Well, then I suggest you plan on moving to a place like Czechoslovakia. Might be a lot freer there within the next couple of years than the United States will be. In fact, Romania might look like paradise by the time Jesse Helms gets done with what he's doing here.
Certainly I don't believe it, but the radical right seems to be, their biggest argument is that exposure of sensitive material will somehow influence the values of young children, young and impressionable kids who will model or mimic the values or the things that they hear about.
Well, I'm more concerned that these people would watch religious broadcasting and model and mimic the values of some of those television evangelists. I mean, if you've exposed your child to years upon years of watching Jimmy Swaggart, I mean, if he didn't even use any four-letter words, and I think he could be hazardous to your mental health. And how about Jim and Tammy? And how about even watching Ronald Reagan, this, you know, the maraca-brained nothingness, running a country? I mean, all of this could be injurious to your mental health. Depends on your point of view. There's some people who think that Swaggart is fabulous and he's a nice guy and he should be on television, and that Jim Baker got a wrong deal, that he should have been allowed to make as much money as he could selling those condos, and that Tammy Faye is a wonderful person. There are people who believe that. I happen to think they're wrong. I also happen to think that if you use four-letter words, that doesn't make you a criminal. It doesn't make you a sinner either.
Why does it make parents with a somewhat even liberal or moderate orientation nervous then?
I have no idea. I think that's probably a mental health problem. A lot of this is a mental health problem. I've said in other interviews, the only way that a person could buy into their argument is if they had gone through 12 years of an American education. Anybody who comes out of the school system could be just numb enough to think that these guys had some merit in their argument, when if you'd avoided a lot of that, you might see through common sense that they're wrong.
They're wrong. They're varmints. We got to get them.
So, you don't think kids would be socialized by hearing songs that have violence towards women in them, or talking about drugs, or talking about sex? Two Live Crew records.
Yeah.
You're a parent. I don't know how young your youngest is, but you wouldn't mind them being exposed to that?
Of course not. What? What's going to happen if you hear a record that says, "Me so horny"? Is the world going to stop?
Yeah, I think a part of a lot of people's paranoia is because they're reading into it from an adult's point of view, and a 4-year-old might not even know what that means or care what that means. It's just abstract.
How many 4-year-olds do you know who know what the word horny means?
Exactly.
And if they do, then it ain't going to harm them, is it?
What about videos where we see Billy Idol with leather and lace, and adults will say that's about bondage and S&M, but a little kid just, he doesn't.
You got any 4-year-old kids who know about bondage? You got a 4-year-old kid who knows about bondage, does bondage, wants to do bondage. I think you have a unique 4-year-old. You might even have a unique 10-year-old. And if they do know about it, what's the difference? Is bondage against the law? Is leather against the law? Well, the shoe industry is going to be pretty upset about that.
Some people have called a parallel here, saying that Luther Campbell is actually a parallel to the Willie Horton thing that George Bush threw at the caucus. Do you see Luther Campbell as being the Willie Horton of the 1990s?
Well, I'm not sure that that's really a good analogy, but I do detect there's a certain racist aroma to a lot of the stuff that's going on. And I've been in the rock and roll business long enough that I remember the first little leaflets that these Christian organizations were dispensing in the 50s that said, don't let your children buy Negro records. It's just a throwback to that. And
the hysteria of jungle rhythms.
Yeah, it's those lewd and lascivious jungle rhythms that will make your teenage daughter gyrate around, and the next thing you know, they'll be having sex with those people, and we can't have that. And basically it gets into changing the color of the race. And, these people who started this stuff years ago, I mean, this has been around since the 50s now. They're lunatics, and they are racist, and they're dangerous people. You can't ignore them. It's as if an entire segment of the population had a special kind of mental disorder, which is protected by the Constitution, by the way. If you can have the most extreme religious beliefs, and you're entitled to them, but the Constitution does provide that those extreme religious beliefs are never to be incorporated into legislation. And that is what we're running into, is they're crossing the line and converting some of their religious dogma into legislation or regulation which will affect the lives and the conduct of people who don't buy into their philosophy.
So you see significance in the fact that a black group was confronted first instead of Sam Kinison or Andrew Dice Clay?
I think that it was not just that they were black. I think that they were chosen because they're not very articulate and because they're from a small label. I can't really see these organizations going after a guy like Eddie Murphy because he's got a few $1 million to fight him, and he can talk good. And from what I've seen of the guys from Two Live Crew, they don't make a very good impression on television in terms of the way they talk. I'm not criticizing them, but I think that the people who chose them as the target did a pretty good job of choosing the target. It's absolutely unfair, and I think that the whole premise of the case against Two Live Crew is based on a superstition, which is that certain people believe there is such a thing as a dirty word, and there isn't. Where's the scientific evidence that a word can be dirty? Things that are dirty, that's the world of hygiene. You can deal with it in terms of hygiene. You don't deal with it in terms of legislation. And the only place where the concept of dirty language exists is within the realm of religious doctrine. Those people who believe that you shouldn't use certain words because it's just the wrong thing to do because of their religion. That's why I say it goes back to the church and state issue. The average guy speaks colorful American English with all kinds of words in it. And what are we going to turn this country into if you can't talk normal in your everyday life?
Do you think newspapers and all media in general didn't pick up on the other half of the Judge Jose Gonzalez decision where they only reported the arrest of Two Live Crew and they didn't report anything about the fact that police were wrong for using a form of prior restraints by telling record store owners if they sold the record that they would be arrested before he made
the average guy understands what prior restraint means? Remember, the reason why this stuff works is because the educational system in this country has been sabotaged. If you take the money out of the education system, and if you censor the books that are available in the schools, and you make sure that the teachers that are in the schools are basically incompetent, and then what are you graduating? You're graduating a bunch of people who are fairly easy to manipulate, because they really aren't very smart. Not that they're bad people, they just never had a chance to get hard data. They were never given real facts about the real world in these times. They've been fed a bunch of nothingness. And they come out of these schools completely unconcerned with real issues, and it's party time. Now, this works to the advantage of a government that is trying to create a police state, but it's exactly the wrong thing if you were to look at the nation as a business which has to compete with other nations which are also businesses. You have a bunch of people graduating from school who are virtually unemployable. They can't read, they can't write, they can't spell, they can't count. What do you have them do? You can only sell so many hamburgers. So until we do something about helping people to improve their intellectual machinery, helping them with the job of sorting out all the facts that are bombarding them in a complex world, then the bad guys are going to get away with a lot of these issues. Because it's easy to fool the average American because he's just been kept stupid.
Is it the media's fault, then, that side of the story wasn't properly reported?
Oh, I think there's plenty of blame to go around all over the place. I think that a lot of it has to come back to the people who allowed the current batch of legislators to sit in their chairs and to write the laws and to run the nation's business. Most of those guys have no business running any business.
Do you think that there was a victory here for prior restraint?
Perhaps, but the real thing that happened in the Gonzales decision was that in stating that the album was obscene, he stated the reason it was obscene is because when you heard it, it led you to have filthy thoughts. Now, he's creating the ground floor of legislation for thought control. If an album can induce a person to filthy thoughts, and if the album should then be banned because it induces filthy thoughts, then any other product or object which induces filthy thoughts should also be taken off the marketplace because it might harm children, like a greeting card or an automobile that had a piece of chrome on it that was too suggestive looking, or certain vegetables in a supermarket. All these things we have to protect our children from this. I mean, that's the logical follow-through on any kind of a decision wherein it says the object induces the consumer to experience filthy thoughts. Thoughts. Now, if his decision is upheld, we have the beginning of case law here. This is a decision that could be referred to by other people in state legislatures and say, based on the Gonzales decision, this zucchini is against the law.
And what obscenity is determined by local standards. What do you think about the whole outgrowth of Dallas and Sacramento and Southern Florida decision?
Because the network of all of these right-wing extremists is pretty far and wide, and California has always been the home to every kind of kook and crackpot that you can think of. Unfortunately, California still works in spite of the fact that we have an abundance of these types of people here, and so it comes as no surprise that the topic would be taken up by some legislative body somewhere in California. Remember, it was a California city that banned Little Red Riding Hood, and every state legislature is full of little small-time crooks who just got elevated to a legislative chair. Who knows how they did it, but they're in there. And because of the way government works, if they write a law, you're stuck with it. Just because you were too busy to pay attention to who was running for what seat and to make a decision based on whether or not that guy ought to have a position of power over you.
You don't think the average California voter, then, who has all the propositions to read through and read the arguments for and against, actually reads them?
Even if you did read the pamphlet that you received, they're worded in such a way that unless you were a lawyer, you can't figure them out. And if you're Hispanic and you're not really familiar with complex language in English, you haven't a clue. So most of the political advertising is based on heartstring tugging. It's not about issues. It's not about the intellectual merits of a case. It's not about facts. It's about buzzwords and pulling on the old heartstrings. The statistic that I heard the other day was that in the mayoral race, only 10% of the eligible voters voted. 10%. 10%. Think about that. People in Romania are dying over voting rights, and they get really excited about elections because, you know, it seems to matter to them. What do we got? 90% stayed away. We don't care. So if we don't care, then we really don't have the right to complain about the way things are. We just let it go. You stay home, you don't participate in democracy, then don't expect democracy to work.
How could people even have a clue then as to how to vote yes or no for the various propositions? And
you know what I do?
What?
I ask a lawyer. What does this say?
Unfortunately, not everyone can do that.
I know, but I mean, at least I take the time and spend the money to find out what does this actually say. Now, I'm not saying everybody should go out and have a lawyer just in order to read that ballot pamphlet, but there are ways to find out. Now, if I find out and somebody asks me, at least I've spent the bucks and I can help to explain it. Why don't we just take a look at it this way? If you have difficulty understanding, let's say KPFK could play a role in this. Anytime that little booklet comes out with all these propositions, why don't you get a lawyer on the air to say, this is what it says? You might even get a lawyer to do it for free, to make a radio star out of him. Please, Mr. Lawyer, come on here and tell us, what does this crap mean in this book? However, we're coming in second best to Arizona this season because Arizona has a law that is it's a law now, and it's even more ridiculous than anything that's been passed in California, and that's the Arizona dildo law. It has just been passed. It is now illegal in Arizona to own more than 5 dildos. Now, figure it out. They debated this long and hard in the state legislature. What is the right number? What is the maximum conscionable number of dildos that a human being may possess in the state of Arizona? And 5 was the answer. Now, I want to know how they're going to enforce the Arizona dildo law. Are we going to have dildo police coming to your home? Dildo police, how many you got in there? Coming in. 6, you're under arrest. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you 6 Dildo Bob. He's going down the river for 15 years. I mean, this is absurd. Now, these people are earning a salary for drafting legislation, and this is what they did. That's Arizona. So come on, California people, we got to catch up. Don't you think we need our own dildo law here? Perhaps with a death penalty attached to it. Show those dildo owners who's really the boss.
Getting back to obscenity all over the country. And at least the way the law is written, it says community standards. And as you mentioned earlier about, and you said zucchini, do you think that local communities aren't going to think for themselves anymore? You know, they were in Texas. You think they're going to base everything on the
What do you mean local communities won't think for themselves? First of all, we have a community deterioration. The whole concept of a community is evaporating before our very eyes. It's every man for himself, or hadn't you noticed?
How can we even say that
in California,
standards?
the whole idea of a neighborhood, what is that? You know?
So it's even impossible to deal with. If you're saying local standards and there really is no local community, how could you even deal with it?
Who computes them? You can't even take a numerical average to create a database for the standard if you can't get people to fill out their census forms. How are you going to develop any kind of hard fact database to establish what a community standard is?
Two Live Crew was arrested on local and state obscenity statutes, but another thing that's looming large over the whole music industry is proposed record rating laws in about 20 states. Most of it's been killed for now, but there's a threat that if they don't police themselves, it's going to come back later. What's your feelings on this?
There'll always be that threat. The people, the people who are making the threat will make sure it comes back later because they're never going to be satisfied. They already have albums with stickers on them. In fact, Two Live Crew had a sticker on it, didn't it? Did that protect them? There's no question that the people who want this they'll spend money because the money is tax-free for them. They can gather up money, send out a mailing, and there's going to be lunatics that'll send them a fortune. The record industry, if it wants to hold its head high, has got to invest some cash to fight this. But I doubt whether they will.
Do you think what happened in, was it 85, by even voluntarily entering in with the PMRC to voluntarily label that was a bad first step?
Absolutely. They should have fought them tooth and nail from the day they first got the PMRC letter. They should have told these people, go stuff it. You got no business meddling in my affairs. You're not a government agency. We don't need to hear about your concerns. Your concerns are worthless. It's a sham. It's just another piece of fundamentalist frogwash. Get out of my face. That's what they should have done, and they should have just given them the finger and walked away. But no. They had two pieces of legislation that they were trying to protect in the Congress. One was H.R. 2911, the blank tape tax, and the other one was this anti-piracy bill. In the case of the blank tape tax, if they could have got the Congress to pass that, they would have picked up $250 million a year in found money, and it would have been collected for them by the U.S. government. They would be in this weird partnership with the IRS collecting in advance this special cash, and the bulk of it would have gone to the record companies, not to the artist. The thing was designed to be distributed on a 90-10 split. 90% to the record companies, 10% to the artist. The government would collect it for them, and it was like a dream come true for the record industry. They weren't going to throw that away. And they knew that the husbands of these ladies in the PMRC sat on the committees that would be hearing their legislation, and so they played footsie with them. And on November 1, 85, they signed an agreement saying they would voluntarily label records. This is not news. This happened in 85. But on October 30th, 1985, was when the blank tape tax got its first hearing in the Congress.
No coincidence.
Yes.
So hindsight's 20/20, but a tactical error that set up what's happening now, you think?
Absolutely. And I think that when the decision was made to bend over, all these smart guys, the executives in the record company, said, hey, it's not our problem. What are we giving up? What do we care whether the free speech rights of some stupid artist is curtailed by this? There's $250 million a year in free money coming in the door. If we can do this, aren't we smarter and more prudent and better businessmen if we just say screw the artist and go for the money? And they all shook hands and nodded and, snorted their cocaine and went on their merry way. That's what happened. Artists, they're a dime a dozen. You have to get rid of one, there's another one coming in the door. There's plenty of artists out there, each one with a better hairdo, each one with more leather, more studs, each one cuter, each one looking more like a girl. Okay? They had the whole thing figured out. There was going to be no problem for them because they were giving up no rights. They were giving up the rights of a third party.
Well, monkey wrenches abound now, and even though they temporarily beat them in most states right now, except for Louisiana, which is still pending, and the threat of it all looms large to come back and haunt again. And a lot of it now is detailing, a lot of bills detail something about S for satanic, substance abuse for records like that. Who's going to do that?
That's what the PMRC started off with. They had an 8-point rating system: O for occult, X for sex, and on and on and on. They had this multiple rating system, and at the Senate hearing, they gave up on all that and just asked for a generic rating. But now these Christian groups are trying to bring that back. When you want to have a satanic rating on a record, first of all, it validates the idea that there is such a thing as a devil. Okay, prove it to me. I believe that once upon a time there was a guy named Jesus, and he was walking around. That's a real guy. A guy with red skin, horns, a long tail, smells like sulfur, has a pointed stick, makes you go to a place where there's fire. That's superstition. And superstition has no place in legislation. So if you create something that says we must protect people from the devil, you're saying that the devil's real, and you got a problem, because the next step is the witchcraft trials.
Something that was in the Missouri bill, which was temporarily defeated, or hopefully permanently defeated, was the fact that there was civil liability if someone could prove in court that a record caused someone to do something antisocial, whether it's suicide or do whatever. How could a record cause someone to do anything?
If there's any evidence that spoken material has caused people to engage in antisocial activities, the preponderance of evidence is against television evangelists whose followers have committed crimes of an even more serious nature. For example, the guy on the Staten Island ferry who appears with a sword and kills 4 people because Jesus told them to do it. The lunatics in this world are in that camp. They're not the people who listen to heavy metal records or rap records. The sick people are the ones who watch these Christian programs on television. These are the ones that There ought to be some civil liability there. As a matter of fact, I would suggest liability insurance for the station owner who puts this stuff on the air. Because if they create legislation that says liability based on hearing somebody say something, that could be stretched to the liability for the broadcaster who put the substance, the audio substance, on the air. And if it can be proven that a person has done something bad because he got the information from watching a religious program, and there's more of that, there's a lot more of that to deal with than there is of any kind of teenage suicide from listening to Ozzy Osbourne, I think if they create that law, it could backfire on them.
In a court of law, who would even say that the Ozzy Osbourne song Suicide Solution was about suicide and it told this person to...
That's been to trial, as far as I know, twice, and has been thrown out both times. And they're still whipping the same dead horse. The last time it went to trial was, the claim was that tucked away inside the grooves of the album was a subliminal 11-cycle tone which drove people to these acts. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the human ear functions between 20 cycles and 20,000 cycles on a good day. If you've got perfect hearing, that's what you can hear. Well, as far as I can tell, there is no recording medium that will reproduce an 11-cycle tone. The bandwidth on a CD is 20 to 20.
And not only that, but all of Wilson Bryant Key's work, the guy who wrote The Art of Subliminal Seduction, has never been empirically proven in a test setting. It's just all hypothesis. So how could courts even award civil liability?
How could the Arizona legislature create the dildo law? Remember, not only is the public intellectually impaired because they've gone through the American educational system, guess what? The guy sitting next to you at the desk in that bad school you went to, he's in the legislation business now. I mean, you have people in government who are intellectually unprepared to engage in any high-level human activity. These are basically used car salesmen that got a promotion, or lawyers, which is worse. So you say, how can you do it? Take a look at who's doing it.
It's been a tricky year. What's the next year look like, Frank? It's going to be better?
Not much better.
Why do you say that?
Because I don't think that there's any signal on the horizon that shows me that the American public is going to wake up and smell the coffee here. I think it's going to be, look, isn't that weird? Look what they're doing in Florida. Oh, that dildo law. That sure is strange. Oh, okay. You just consume it as entertainment. The news is consumed as entertainment. It doesn't motivate you.
When's the point going to come when people start rebelling?
In America, not.
Sounds pretty bleak.
Well, you asked my opinion. That's my opinion. I can't really see any kind of grassroots rebellion of any description in this country because it's too sedated.
Do you think that's media rhetoric, always saying that the next decade is going to be like the 60s and we're going to return to 60s values? What's the future for the 90s?
I'm not sure that the 60s values were all that terrific. I mean, they start to look pretty good compared to the 80s and 90s values. But I wouldn't say that the 60s was any kind of a golden age, because there were a lot of stupid things that occurred during the 60s. I will say that it is my opinion that the condition that we're in now is bordering on terminal as far as the political and social health of the country is concerned.
So we're just going to become a fascist state?
Unless we do something about it, that is what's at the end of the road. Fascist state. We're talking about Romania too. We're talking about having our own personal Ceausescu here. His name will be easier to pronounce, of course. Probably be a one-syllable word, like Bush or Quail or something like that, but the result is the same. Secret police spying on your phone calls. How many dildos you got in there? That's what you got.
Frank, thanks for your insights.
Welcome.
Fire and chains and other objectionable tools of gratification in some twisted mind.
You've been listening to ZAPPA on Censorship. Frank Zappa in conversation with J.B. Peterson. This program was produced for KPFK and Pacifica Radio by J.B. Peterson. The associate producer was Lucy Frears.
Rather than the emotional damage we're suffering.
The Arizona law to which Mr. Zappa referred was twice introduced into their state house. It has never been ratified, although efforts still continue. Ironically, despite Pacifica Radio's efforts to promote the ideal of freedom of speech, portions of this interview had to be censored in accordance with current FCC guidelines. Your feelings about FCC restrictions on sensitive language can be addressed to the Federal Communications Commission, 1919 M Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20554. For Pacifica Radio, this is Lucy Frears.
We hear next a talk given by Frank Zappa at the New School on February 21st of 1969. The talk was recorded in Carmen Moore's popular music class, and Mr. Zappa is introduced by Carmen Moore. We regret the alteration and deletion of certain words.
I gave a talk at USC a couple of months ago in a social history class where the professor made a very interesting point. He believes that the history of this age will not be left in books, but will be left in the recorded works. Not just music, but there's a lot of spoken material that's been committed to record. And it'll be a much better history than somebody could write down. And it's an intriguing possibility to think that if you were in the record industry, you have a way or a hold on shaping the history and actually making some of those things happen, not just reporting it, but actually making it happen. And I think Bob Dylan had a lot to do with that the minute he went electric and got some of his messages onto the radio where larger numbers of people could hear it. And also people who had never come into contact with his music before were brought face to face with it on the radio once it was put into a rock and roll framework. And from that moment, I think that we began to see something of what they call now a youth revolution, which isn't a revolution at all. It's a bunch of people who are still very confused, but who are now taking the time to ask some questions to the people who have been keeping them stupid all this time. Any questions? Okay, that's all I got to say.
Okay. Well, in backing this up, I talked to Stockhausen a few months ago. He's a modern classical composer. And we were talking about rock and roll. Anyway, Stockhausen said that he detested rock and roll and that he'd spend a lot of time listening to it. And I asked him why. And he was frankly afraid of the fact that this power that the music had to organize people around one tune, or whatever the tune's lyrics were about, was something that he saw at work in Nazi Germany. And he talked about sights of German youth all standing there together in big rallies and stadiums, all singing the same song and grooving to it, but ready to go out and bust heads. So this has frightened him into not being able to listen to rock and roll.
We were in Germany recently. We played 5 dates in Germany last fall. And the German youth today has not come very far from the ones in the short pants singing the same song. Today, the German youth, you know, they have sort of their own brand of flower power over there. They have hairy boys and girls with beads and funny clothes, and they're Nazis. Just like their mothers and fathers. And the problem is, they believe they are the new left. They believe that they are the new, what's happening, forefront of the youth revolution, you know, that student riot that happened last Easter in Berlin. It's just a crazed fantasy that these kids have that they're actually doing something new. I talk with them, and they're
But for the Germans, that's new.
That's new?
Wearing the beads.
Yeah, well, it's just a question of packaging. Yes, they are to a certain extent, you know. But like the purpose of their organization is still a little bit cloudy, you know. They talk about a revolution in sort of carnival terms. They're still thinking about banners, gathering together in the street and yelling things at policemen. You know, that's their idea of a revolution. You know, and it's so old-fashioned and corny, even. You know? No, they act along Nazi lines.
I heard that they wanted you to lead something. What's that?
We had an incident at a concert in Berlin where I was approached by some student leaders. They told me they were student leaders, you know. When someone comes up and introduces himself to you and says, "Hello, I'm a student leader." Little red scarf around his neck, flowing over the shoulder, sort of a revolutionary flow down here on the side, and little hair frizzing out to the side, little beard, little khaki coat, surrounded by people who are trying to dress exactly like Che Guevara, you know. They had sort of like a little Robin Hood band of German rockers, okay? And we're going to play a concert at the Sportpalast, which is one of the places where Hitler delivered some real spiffy speeches during the war. And we're at this rehearsal in the afternoon. This guy says, "I'd like to talk to you for a minute. We'd like your assistance with a political action this evening at the concert." Yeah? I said, "Well, what do you have on your mind?" And he said, "Well, there'll be about 8,000 kids here tonight, and most of them have never demonstrated before, and we would like to have you tell them to come with us while we go around the corner and set fire to the Allied Command Center." And I told him I didn't think that was good mental health. And he got really pissed off, you know. And so they tried to wreck our show. The minute we came out on stage, about 35 or 50 of these kids out in the audience, activists, I believe, would be what you'd call them, they whipped out a large red banner, waved it, sang "Ho Ho Ho Chi Minh," blew air horns, threw vegetables on stage, marched around in the audience while the rest of the 8,000 kids were there going like this. They didn't know what was going on. So we continued to play. We had to play a 2-hour show in the middle of all this bullshit. And these guys are out there stomping around and raw and throwing stuff, and the people on the bandstand are getting hit with hard vegetables, you know, like cucumbers and squash, you know, like they really hit you like a rock up there. And they were throwing eggs and cherry bombs, and then they grabbed this big fence, you know, like a restraining device that they have to keep the audience away from the performers at those events. It was made out of pipes this big around with a chain link fence in between with concrete feet, and about 30 of them picked it up and tried to throw it on stage, which would have killed both of our drummers by pinning them against the amplifiers, you see. So our manager, Herbie, and this German promoter named Fritz Rau caught it in midair and threw it back on him. And then this other guy charged the stage, and Herbie put his foot through his face. And then they kept on throwing things, and then they kept on trying to get up onto the stage, and we kept pushing these guys back, and we're up there humming and strumming. And it was really a very unusual situation. So then we had to take an intermission, see? And we left the stage after an hour of fun and merriment. And during that time, the ordiners that the local promoter had hired to keep everything under control at the Hop thought we had run off. So they ran away. And when they ran away, about 100 of these kids wailed up onto the stage and started stomping all over our equipment. See? So we come back from intermission, and here's all these people milling around on stage. They don't even know why they're there. They look like cows. They're standing like this, but they're standing, you know, on drums, and they're knocking things over, and a few of the guys had stolen small pieces of equipment and disappeared into the audience, you know, and they're just making a lot of noise and standing around, just completely blank. They don't even know what their revolution is about. So we started pushing them off the stage. We put our equipment back together. We got the PA system working, and I gave them a speech for about 15 minutes, wherein I discussed the possibility that they were acting more like Americans than anything that I've ever seen, and that pissed them off. And they're out there yelling, revolution, revolution. And I'm saying, you people need evolution, not revolution. They said, no, take it back. You're the mothers of reaction. And I told them they were and they understand English. So I told them whether they liked it or not, we were going to continue to play the second half of the program. So gradually they shut up. And they sat down. The only thing that happened during the second hour was one cherry bomb on stage. And we played about 45 or 50 minutes, and we were into a long instrumental piece, which was going to be our closing number. And I'd reduced the volume of the tune so that I could say goodnight to the nice German people. At which point, the student leader with a red rag around his neck comes running up on stage and grabs the microphone and starts raving in German. I just knew he was telling these people, I've got the matches, come with me. You know? So we played real loud so nobody could hear what he was saying. Two people were taking the instruments off the stage, you know, piece by piece, pulling things away till it was just me and the organist left on stage playing one full volume, fuzz tone, loud, ugly note that was just going blah. And it was the only thing that kept the people back off the stage, because they kept trying to get up onto the stage, and this noise at him, they go back. Finally, when they got all the drums and all the rest of the stuff out of the way, we just unplugged and split off the stage, and they all came milling back up there. And then they looked around and they didn't know why they were on stage again.
Yeah.
That's Germany today.
Lumpy Gravy was written as a ballet first, wasn't it? Planned.
Yeah.
Are there any plans for that? Any possibilities?
I doubt if it'll ever get a ballet.
Yeah. And it's a collaboration between the group, between the mothers and. Is that a pickup orchestra or is it
It's a pickup orchestra.
Yeah. Right.
I understand your Freakout album sold about 250,000 records.
It's hard to tell from MGM.
Has Marvel comic book advertising been successful?
Yeah, amazingly successful. We got a lot of letters from servicemen because they're big comic book readers. I received a letter from a guy in Vietnam. He says, I can kill and feel nothing. Can you use me? And we also received a lot of letters from servicemen who weren't interested in the mothers too much, but they were very interested in Sizzy Cream Cheese. And were very anxious to get pictures of Sizzy Cream Cheese, unclothed if possible.
I believe it was on that album you did a number about Watts, and I think you wrote on the liner that you had trouble selling that. Now that you're in business for yourself, do you find you have more freedom, or where's the freedom?
We have a lot more freedom now, yeah. Because there's the deal that we have with the distributor for our product now is they can't refuse to put it out because of what's on it or what the package is. They can't censor it in any way. Yeah.
What are you going to do with Bizarre Records? I mean, what are you looking forward to do?
Well, I'm interested in making available to the public types of music and types of spoken material on record that they wouldn't ordinarily be able to obtain from the important record companies. Yeah.
How long did it take you to write the theme for Lumpy Gravy?
That was written the same night as Who Are the Brain Police, and it took approximately 20 minutes.
It took you 20 minutes?
Yeah. Well, that's just the theme, though. The orchestration is a lot more tedious work because there's more dots to draw.
You talk about the idea behind What We Do for the Money, what you were trying to do, especially in relation to Sgt. Pepper.
The only relation to Sgt. Pepper was the cover, you know.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of trouble getting permission to do that. The stupidity of two record companies plus the Beatles' apparent disinterest in seeing a parody done of anything that they might have put out. They hung us up for about 8 months. And the reason I say that the history of today is recorded on records, even if the material is bad, even if the performance is bad, even if the words are bad, even if the whole thing is really that certainly is a record of today. You know, the worst popular music is also the best indicator of the mental condition of the people who buy that record and make it a hit. You know, just think of top 40 tunes in competition with each other. It's an exciting game that these people play. You know, we'll make a hit, we'll put it out there, and we'll get to be number one. And very few of the people who are engaged in the music business on a singles level have any concern whatsoever for the absolute musical content of what they're doing, but they are engaged in a game. It's just like having a football team. Your group is a team, and you're going up against the team from the other school, and you have school spirit in your group, and the groupies that follow your group are cheerleaders for your group, and they might as well dress like cheerleaders with little skirts and megaphones, you know, and they cheer you on, hoping that your record will get to be number one before the other team's record gets to be number one. It's really entertaining. Yes?
When you compose, do you involve yourself with these various methods of serial development or serialization?
Well, when I was 18 and I first found out that there was such a thing as combining numbers with dots, I tried it. And if you're a composer in the United States, and I'm sure you got this one down, that it takes a long time before you even get a chance to hear what you wrote, because there's just too many problems between the person who writes the music and actually getting it acoustically realized. It's just a ridiculous chain of events. You have to go through a whole bunch of middlemen who are really very disinterested in the process of composition. The average musician who is capable of performing serial music is really interested in earning a living, because he's certain he can give a about the music, you know.
Well, how about like Lumpy Gravy, for instance? Like on what basis did you develop
that's not a serial operation. What I was going to tell you is that the minute I finally got a chance to hear some of the serial experiments that I had done performed, I didn't like them. You know, I knew that the serial integrity was there, that this equaled that, and so many rests equal this density of bullshit over here and like that. And then when you hear it, who gives a you know? Nobody else is going to hear all the mathematics that went into it, you know, so why bother? I'd rather write Reuben and the Jets.
And listening to Lumpy Gravy and some of the stuff on Rolling Into the Money, I find it, I'm constantly curious, and I've often hope that I have the opportunity to ask you, what do you feel in terms of your own, you know, like purpose as an artist, is the function of parody, which you do a great deal of, and or the real, like, absolute music that you write, which is so, has a, at times is extremely melodic and very sort of Shostakovichian, that's a word. You know, like those long, flowing melodic lines you write. I mean, do you ever see yourself as getting out of the parody bag, or do you think you'll always kind of keep these two things going together?
Well, it amazes me, you know, I hear people talk about serious music, you know.
I didn't say that.
No, wait a minute.
Okay.
And people talk about serious music, and the one thing that most serious music seems to have built into it that makes me vomit is its lack of humor, you know. And I think I seriously write parody.
Right.
You know? And I like things that'll crack me up, because I sit at home and listen to those albums too. And there are things in there that I'll laugh at that nobody else will ever find out about, because if they did, they would die. You know. And I do all that stuff for my own amusement, and it pleases me if somebody else likes it.
Yeah.
And if somebody else doesn't like it, then it's just, you know, that's okay too.
I mean, like, how do you feel like about that? I mean, obviously there's a great deal of what, I don't know what the term would be, because terms in music are so confused these days, but for the kind of things that are just these sweeping melodic things that you write. Which
I've written some sweeping melodic parodies in my time.
But you know what I mean. I mean, do you find that is as satisfying, or as achieves any kind of a purpose as satisfying to you as the you know, the funny stuff?
I like it all. You know, so long as the performance turns out good and the recording turns out satisfactory, and I can get a chance to sit at home and listen to it. You know, like a composer, I'm speaking only for myself, I don't know why he does it, but I write music because I want to hear what it sounds like. If I put some dots down on a piece of paper, I'm curious to know what those combinations are going to sound like. And it's very disturbing and frustrating if you have to wait a long time before you hear it. Now that I've put up with a certain amount of bull to get into the record business where I can write something and within a short period of time actually get to hear it and put it onto a tape where I can listen to it over and over again, study it, teach myself something else, and then go on to write new combinations, you know, that's basically what motivates me to put that music together, because I get my jollies through my ears. See.
Oh, I always concentrate on what I'm playing, but I can hear the rhythm section. I have the type of discipline where I can either play their rhythm. Actually, what was happening last night on some of the solos, I was using a digital delay that had a single chord stored in it, and it was on a loop. And every time that loop would come around, would have a certain rhythm, which was totally irrelevant to what the rhythm of the bass and drums were doing. So I had a choice of 2 different established rhythms that I could play, plus the option of choosing a third one that was completely between those. There's no reason why the human mind shouldn't be able to compute that kind of math when they hear it, and it leads you into some interesting harmonic and melodic directions. For example, a melody functions in a harmonic climate. The chord that is being played is the harmonic climate. That's, if it's an augmented chord, it's a mysterious climate. If it's a diminished chord, it's a little tenser. If it's minor, it's serious. If it's major, it's happy. If it's major 7th, you're falling in love. If it's augmented 11th, it's bebop. You know, these are all established harmonic aromas that people recognize, whether they do it consciously or not. That's what's built into you. So melody functions against a harmonic climate in terms of what is the fractional delay between the time that you hit a note that is tension to that chord to the time that you hit a note which is inside the chord, which creates a resolution. That's how melodies work. How many notes are you playing in your line that rub against the chord versus how many notes are inside the chord that takes the tension to rest? Your ear is computing that, okay? Now, if you're playing a straight disco number where everybody is marching along to the same beat, well, your options for the amount of intrigue you can create with a melody improvised against a chord are pretty limited, because the minute you stray from an exact 16th note fluctuation, the disco consumer loses interest because he wants everything to sound like it came out of a Casio rhythm machine. But with the type of stuff that I do, once the solo begins, unless it's a fixed 12-bar thing like I did 2 choruses on Penguin and Bondage in the key of D, that's that. But if it's an open-ended solo that starts with a single tonality, I can do amazing things in that context if you understand what is happening musically, what's going on. Some people listen to it and say, that's awfully weird, or that scale is strange, or those notes are weird. But there's a reason for doing it, and there's a lot of skill involved in choosing those notes, and there's also a lot of skill involved in the rhythm section being able to accompany me in what I'm doing. That bass player is great at following me. He's one of my favorite bass players to work with because his harmonic concept, he understands what I'm doing when I do those things. And one of the techniques I was using last night was the chord that was stored in the loop has no third in it. That means the pitch of the chord, which determines whether it's major, minor, augmented, or diminished, is missing. All you have is the root, the second, and the fifth. When you have those 3 intervals in there, you still hear it as a chord, but the notes that you can play against it enable you to encompass all the different variations of the nature of the chord. You can play major thirds, minor thirds, and everything in between against that chord. It's more like a neutral piece of canvas that you can paint on. And consequently, the bass notes that support that chord, a lot of different bass notes can be used, and each one that goes against the chord creates another set of mathematical possibilities for the melody notes that are happening on top of it. And when you combine that with the mathematical possibilities of what the harmonic rhythm of the melody notes will be, how many rub, how many relax, you know, and all that stuff, that's a world of opportunities during each song. And I love doing that during the show. That's my favorite thing to do in the show.
Yeah, here's one good rule. Anything wrong played twice is the beginning of an arrangement. Or any 2 people playing the same mistake is an arrangement. That's a pretty easy way to start.
Are you a disciplined musician?
To a degree, yeah. I mean, I can read it and I can write it. I write it better than I read it, but I like structure. But I also like structures that leave a hole in there so that you can just make something up on the spot, because the audience likes that better, too. but makes it hard to be a hit, doesn't it?
So what? Who needs a hit, you know? You know what I mean? I've managed to earn a living without hits. Think of it. This is America in the 20th century.
You're famous without hits.
That's right. The best-kept musical secret in the United States, ladies and gentlemen.
But you can't be a musical secret, all these people calling in tonight who know you.
Well, my favorite composers to listen to are Stravinsky, Webern, Veretz, and Penderecki. I think I find more things of interest for my ear in those composers than I do in any number of pop groups that you could name. The audience exists. It's, you know, it's perhaps not as large as the audience for Grand Funk Railroad, but it's there nonetheless and is in need of servicing. There are some people who might be interested in hearing that music who have never heard it before and who might just like to go out and see what it does to their mind to get a little bit of it on them. It's my premise that you can have harmony constructed out of rhythms. That's the way I look at it. And without getting into a series of charts, graphs, diagrams, and explaining technically how all that's done. That's one of the things that my listening to forms of music other than rock and roll has brought to the performance of the Mothers. And I would probably tend to agree with Lucas Foss's evaluation of The Rite of Spring, although it's one of my favorite pieces. He feels that it's sort of like bigger and better Rimsky-Korsakov. In a way it is. It's more than that, but I think that the L'Histoire du Soldat has probably got a lot more going for it in terms of real innovation and its rhythmic vitality, interesting sonorities that just didn't exist in chamber music prior to that time. What I'm interested in doing is writing music that I want to hear, okay? If there happen to be some people who have similar taste to me, then they would like to listen to that too. However, the music is made available to anybody who wants to hear it. The concerts are open to the public. The records are on sale to anybody who wants to buy them. The radio stations are free to pick and choose what they want to play. You know, it's sort of a low-pressure operation, you know.
Where are you going, Frank?
Well, I'm going just wherever I can, you know.
You're going out into jazz and into Webern and into all those places?
I started off in Webern. I'm trying to get back.
Working your way home?
Yeah, I'm working my way back from Vienna.
Are you really interested in that kind of music, in atonal serial music? Do you compose in tone rows and things like that, or is it more American than that?
No, I started off composing serial music. I was writing serial music when I was 18. I never had a chance to get any of it performed because I was living in a little town where there weren't too many musicians around who could read or play well enough to count the rhythm and read all the elaborate dynamic markings that are usually connected with serial music, because you serialize your dynamics as well as your pitches, and you can also serialize your rhythm. So I was doing that kind of stuff a long time ago, and
now you're wreaking your vengeance, eh?
No. What happened was I finally did get a chance to hear some of the serial material performed, and maybe it was the performance that I finally got of it, or maybe it was just that I decided to do something else, but I stopped writing serial music. You know, I was writing all kinds of positive and negative canons and weird inverted this and retrograde that, and getting as spaced out mathematically as I could, and I was going, wait a minute. Who cares about that stuff, you know, because I'd always liked rhythm and blues, so here I was stuck between the slide rule and the gut bucket somewhere, and I decided that I would opt for a third road someplace in between.
How would you describe that road, other than that you like the road?
It's winding.
Do you tell your kids anything about television? Do you rap to them about what television is and how it works and what the tricks are?
We explain to them that the people on television who tell them things are getting paid to say that. And they can understand that. So consequently, we take them places, and if somebody says something that appears to be a little bit mysterious to them, whether it's television or not, they'll ask us, is he getting paid to say that? And I think that's something to remember all the time. Is he getting paid to say that? Is he getting paid to do that?
Yeah, but just imagine what would happen if they played my records on the radio.
because what I do doesn't sound like format radio. Radio today, I don't know whether you listen to musical radio, but most of it all sounds the same. Each song, no matter who the artist is, they all sound like it came out the same little cookie cutter, and if my stuff sounds different, then it's a jarring element in a format. And many people who format radio stations don't want that jarring element.